I recently had an email from Julia, who said to me, I'm relatively new at sewing, and my biggest challenge is to stay on track and finish things. Another problem is that I'm not sure if my ideas are going to work. Sometimes I come up with a lot of ideas, but when I start, I often lose my confidence and worry about the project. My goal is to design and sew my own corsets and no longer be afraid that my ideas aren't good enough. So thank you for writing to me, Julia. And just, first of all, good for you in that you know what you want. So many people will stay rooted in the problem, but you're actually focusing at the end there on what it is you actually want at the end of this. So all props to you, 10 points to you for focusing on identifying and focusing on what you actually want in the future and not just being rooted in the problem you're having right now. So you want to sew your own corsets and no longer be afraid that your ideas aren't good enough. So let's look at this too. So what's going wrong here? You're having all these great ideas, but then when you actually start working on it, you lose your confidence and worry about the project. I think we can all identify with that sometimes. So what's happening here is that you're having all these ideas in your head and getting all inspired, but when you actually try to do it with your hands, when you actually try and make it work in the real world, you start going, this isn't going to plan. Oh, I'm not sure if this is going to work. I'm not sure whether this was a good idea. I think the shift here is about the meaning that you create when it starts not to work out, when you start to try and translate it into a 3D real thing and you realise that it's not working how you wanted it to. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was a terrible idea. I mean, the process of translating an idea in your head into a real thing, that is the work to figure out how to make the idea real. So it's not like people who are very confident makers are always coming up with perfectly formed ideas that ideally form themselves into the ideal solution immediately. We all have projects, and I would say most of our projects, where we have this great idea and then we come to it and come to do it and we're like, oh wait, this isn't actually working out like I wanted, and there are like twists and turns and you have to figure out where to go with it. For example, I had a project where I wanted to recreate a famous historic dress, and I went to the museum and I found it and I went to visit it and take a pattern and see how it worked. But when I opened it up and had this thing flat on the table, I realised that the whole bodice was all shattered, the silk had all shattered, and I wasn't going to be able to take a pattern off this thing at all, certainly without damaging it. It was so mangled and shattered and coming apart that I wasn't really going to be able to make a pattern that I could trust. You know, it wasn't going to happen the way I thought it would. So I came home and I found a different way to do it. I found a pattern drafting book from the same year the pattern was made, and I found a pattern that would work. So it's not that your idea isn't going to work, it's just you haven't found out the right method to make it work yet. You know, you sometimes have to take a different route. The other thing to do is just detach yourself from the final outcome. We sometimes think that a project isn't valid if it isn't perfect, if it just doesn't come out quite how you wanted it. I think it would be useful if we renamed our projects. Instead of projects, why don't we call them experiments? Because really, you've got to have some of the most confident, successful makers I've ever known. They're like mad scientists. They're not like picking a particular project and getting very attached to it and it has to come out perfect. They're just picking projects based on, why don't we try this? Let's try this crazy idea and see if it works. Let's try this crazy idea and just see what happens. And then each project becomes a trial run for the next project. It's like I always say, every project, everything you make is a mock-up. Everything you make is a mock-up for the next project, for the next experiment. So if you think of your projects as experiments, then you start to be able to detach yourself from the idea that the outcome has got to be perfect in order to have been worth the time you spent or the money you spent working on it. So I have a project, for example, where I had this nuts idea that I wanted to make a pair of stays that would be like a modern top. but like a modern crop top. So I wanted to make like a short pair of stays. So it was like a 17th century pair of stays, but I wanted it to be like, to finish under the bust. And it totally didn't work, because I made the thing, I finished it, I put it on, and it just didn't stay up. It would come down because the pressure of my chest pushing down on it, because a pair of stays pushes you up, so my chest is pushing down on it, so it didn't stay up in the sort of, it finished like here, and it just kept riding down and slipping down. It just didn't stay up, and it just didn't work. So now that project is in the bottom of a box somewhere, but I don't see it as a failure. It was just an experiment that didn't work. Okay, that didn't work. Try something else. So if you can just detach from the outcome, you'll find that your projects become experiments, and you see, instead of every project having to be perfect, it just becomes a learning curve. Every project you do is just a step on a learning curve to learn a set of skills and master a set of skills. So designing and sewing your own corsets or your own clothes of any kind, it isn't about getting to a point where everything comes out perfect. It's just a series of experiments and a series of explorations into this art form, into this science. So to summarise, first of all, good for you, Julia, for focusing on the goal. That's a great piece of advice in itself. If anybody else out there is having trouble, that's a great piece of advice in itself. Just to stay focused on what you really want in the future, what you want to be doing, and not to be focused on the problem right now. Just be focused on designing and sewing your own corsets, and that's where you're going to be going. Change the meaning of something not working out. If you're trying to translate an idea in your head into something that's real and it's not going how you wanted it to, then that's not a reason to think that it was a bad idea. It's just like, detach yourself from having that meaning that, oh God, it's not working and it's not worth it. You need to go to a place where the meaning of it is, well, okay, go to plan B. That's the meaning of a project. The meaning of making something a reality is trying a number of different things to see if you can make it work and see if something else comes up. It's just a process of experimentation, and then finally detaching yourself from the outcome so that every project doesn't have that pressure on you that every project's got to come out perfect, because it's just an experiment. It's an experiment and a mock-up for the next one. Okay, so I hope that helps, Julia. And so why don't you leave a comment below and tell me about an idea that you've had in your head that you want to translate into reality, but you haven't had the courage to do it yet. Tell me about that idea in the comments below, and I'll see you next week.